Um, uh, so this spread identity, right, evolved as the SI paradigm evolved in my research as a natural culmination of prior work on the dynamic transport selection. And I'm happy to say that way back in 2000 and 2002, for example, right, we realized quickly that um, what is happening now, right, with the wireless services exploding, right, that you would have a choice of your transport mechanism, right? You could have your iPhone, so you could be simultaneously, let's say, subscribing to two or three services, right? You could have, in principle, your BlackBerry, your iPhone, and something else, right? And in addition, also have access to Wi-Fi or whatever. So the question was, how would you, how could you aggregate the bandwidth of all these different channels if you wanted to, right? At a particular point, supposing you really wanted bandwidth on demand, right? Lots of bandwidth, wireless bandwidth. How could you aggregate the connection, the bandwidth of these connections, which were links which were owned by independent ISPs, right? Independent internet service providers. So each link would have its own independent provider and different IP address. And so that in turn, that's what we call dynamic transport selection. The title is quite appropriate, as you can see here, because you would have to decide which transport to use so as to minimize either the jitter or just maximize the bandwidth or delay or whatever else that was the parameter of interest, right? So therefore, we called it the dynamic transport selection problem. And I was glad that I think a couple of years back there's a team from the UCSD School of Business, right? And as part of their graduation, they had to come up with some ideas. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, they were contacting me, asking me if I had done any patents on the paper that we published in Infocom 2002. I told him I had not. Then he was interested in finding out whether the mechanisms we had developed in that paper were applicable, and they were trying to commercialize that. And they were trying to that company is based on, I have all the slides if you want, of the company stock and all that, but that be that as it may. So after the bandwidth aggregation, I kept on thinking, right, about multiple interfaces, because that was the wave of the future, right? You're going to have multiple transport conduits. So what is it that you can do when you have these multiple IP links, right? So therefore, as the study of that topic continued, then the spread identity paradigm emerged. And it appears to me that it should be commercially viable. And the meta concept, as you will see, is applicable pretty much anywhere. And so I was joking, I'm saying that time will tell whether it's a pointer to a lot of dollars or pointer to null. Star null is essential C syntax, right? So it's a pointer to null. Okay, so for the dynamic transport selection, the motivation was that the rapid selection of wireless technologies, right, and whatever, right. So the selection of best transport method is called dynamic optimization problem. To track the current network and node conditions, right, etc. So the more general problem is to select K best out of N network interfaces available to a node, and for the purpose of either bandwidth aggregation, jitter control, and so on and so forth. So these are always you can quickly see that is the bandwidth aggregation application that gets studied the first one. Right? So that's what we ended up doing, jitter control and all that, right? So we started asking right around 2003 and 2004, what is left? What else do multiple interfaces give you that a single interface may not necessarily give you, right? So the question was, how would you leverage multiple interfaces for added security? That's the thing that I started looking at right around 2003 and 2004. So here is the problem, right? So it has M interfaces, and the source has M interfaces, destination has N. The important issue is they are controlled by independent ISPs, right, imposing their own firewalls. So the questions that we started asking ourselves were the following, right? Is a single link with strong security infrastructure, is it good enough, right? Because people do trust their home computers for even for banking, right, nowadays, for everything pretty much. So do you really need multiple interfaces? With the strong security infrastructure in place, isn't a single link good enough? What does the presence of multiple links really buy you? Right. So therefore, a strong security infrastructure includes a PKI, a public key infrastructure for key exchange, certification and authentication, and a strong symmetric key algorithms, for example, for AES and whatever, right, and HMAC, message verifying data integrity, right, digest creation. So even a single link together with strong SSI adequately addresses the basic security attributes, namely authentication, integrity, confidentiality, and non-repudiation, right? So a strong SSI is already in place for critical applications such as bank transactions and others, right? So what, if anything, can multiple interfaces add towards security? Right? That was the thing that we started asking ourselves. So must evaluate it. So the issue here is that it must be evaluated in the context of single link plus SSI, because that is already there, it's already deployed, right? So unless the multiple links buy you anything, there is no point just having multiple links for the sake of having multiple links. So the questions we started asking were the following, right? Can multiple interface provide additional security? Can they provide something that a single interface fundamentally cannot, right? And the second question was, can they at least achieve the same level of security as a single interface with a strong SSI, but at a lower cost in terms of computation, latency, infrastructure required, and so on and so forth, right? Which is a fair comparison, right? So it is obvious that the intrinsic multiple advantages of multiple links are the following, right? Even with an SSI in place, a single link is always more susceptible to DOS attacks, right? That's something that a single interface can never. If you have multiple interfaces, you are likely to be more resilient to a DOS attack, right, and DDoS attack. Multiple links provide higher flexibility, reliability, and availability. That's clear, right? And higher throughput, which can translate into security in critical situations, right? It is possible to achieve the same level of security at a lesser cost, right? The fundamental reason is that the adversary needs to monitor all paths to mount man-in-the-middle attacks, man-in-the-middle and/or replay attacks, right? Because the adversary has to monitor multiple paths now. So equivalent security at a lesser cost, right? So we looked at whether a key agreement without public key cryptography is possible. I mean, the issue was threshold cryptography. If supposing you use threshold cryptography, right? So there's the split the key into some n r bigger than n parts, right? N is the number of interfaces, suppose, right? And set the threshold t equal to r. So and to get the key, all r pieces must be captured, right? So the r pieces are transmitted along the n interfaces, right? So now adversary must snoop along all the n interfaces for a longer time to retrieve the entire key, right? The threshold secret sharing scheme can be extended to detect if any of the pieces has been modified, thereby making it feasible to detect a man-in-the-middle attack also, right? See, that's the part. This is a very neat thing, right? Because you can even detect if somebody man-in-the-middle. Otherwise, if you have single key, right, single secret, then a man-in-the-middle is completely successful, right? Because you know the man-in-the-middle, right? It breaks the connection and initiates a separate connection with the other party and separate connection with you. You have no clue, right? But here, because unless they do a man-in-the-middle simultaneously on all the parts of the secret, right? Then they might get caught, right? So this is one advantage that multiple links will have, right? That a single link will not have. Right? That's it. So the idea was if you can then establish that a man-in-the-middle is sufficiently mitigated, right, by using multiple interfaces, then unauthenticated Diffie-Hellman exchange would be good enough. And such a Diffie-Hellman exchange is a better method for establishing shared secret than threshold cryptography alone, right? Only snooping would do. So why? Because only snooping will suffice to break the code in the former case, right? So the combination of the two. See, what do you think is the drawback of the Diffie-Hellman? Why do you need this public? Why can you not just use Diffie-Hellman all the time? What do you think is the problem with that?
Susceptible to man-in-the-middle.
Yeah, the only susceptibility of Diffie-Hellman exchange is the man-in-the-middle, right? And if by using multiple interfaces this way, right, especially using threshold, right, it is difficult, the man in the middle's job is a lot harder, right? So therefore a combination of Diffie-Hellman exchange together with threshold crypto should be able to compete, right, at least in principle with heavy duty public private thing, right? So this is infrastructureless, right, which would be good. You don't need to actually, no, actually we have to be very careful, right? When I say infrastructureless, you have to be extremely careful. No, that's not. Okay, so I did a lot of work in that direction, right? And so some of these details, right? Equivalent security at less encryption effort, right? And you can find this in the paper. There is a paper that I ended up publishing in IEEE SecureCom in 2005, right? Where this topic is discussed. But this is really not the main thrust here, right? So therefore, okay, so in effect, the issue that I realized was the following. I did some work, and it turns out that just a few number of links is okay, but it's really not that great, right? If I calculate the probabilities, whatever I did here, right? If you go through these expressions, right? It turns out that whatever I could get, right, was really not. It was good. It was going in the right direction, but was really not enough. I needed something to amplify the effect of multiple physical interfaces, right? Practical links are more susceptible also, right? So therefore, the thought that then came to my mind was, why not spread identity or multiple IP addresses via extended multi-homing, right? So as far as the other people, man-in-the-middle adversaries are concerned, right? They have no clue, right? As far as they are concerned, the apparent effective number of interfaces is increased, and they don't have an idea whether this IP address really belongs to a different interface or not, right? All they say is the same source is using multiple IP addresses, right? So therefore, so then it became clear that once we start doing this, right, the spread identity mechanisms can be leveraged as dynamic access control tokens for extremely fast detection of misbehavior also, right? So and so the deal here was that the spread identity mechanism, right, it obviates the need for physically distinct interfaces. It could achieve the same effect just by playing this software game, right, on either side. And number of interfaces are still limited. You have to realize that no matter what, nobody is going to have 100 interfaces. At most 3, 4, 5, right? Even if somebody creates a universal device, right, that can simultaneously access Sprint network and whatever, AT&T network and whoever else, right? All the competitors. Still, the number of networks is going to be, you can count on your hands, right? 4, 5, 6. It's not going to be 100 networks. So the number of interfaces is that way limited to a few. But the number of IP addresses in principle could be made that you could have, if you do it right, could be very large, right? If I do it on a subnet basis, I could suddenly allocate, entire subnet, right? A class B subnet has how much? Class B subnet has 256 square addresses, right? That's a lot of 16,000 addresses. That's a lot. So so the idea was to leverage multiple IP addresses to try and achieve an effect similar to having physically a lot of multiple interfaces. And so the earlier version of this idea was published in SecureCom in September 2005, and it was a little bit clumsy, right? So this was the first version, right? It was true end-to-end, and it therefore was a little bit clumsy, right? And so the idea there was that dynamic extended multi-homing, right? So most of the operating systems already have full support for multi-homing. So dynamically assign and deassign multiple addresses to any number of interfaces, right? For distributed denial of service resilience, even if a single interface with multiple addresses, even a single interface with multiple addresses is sufficient, and that will show how to play that game. In effect, this is tantamount to the ability to acquire multiple identities. So that's the big idea here, right? So for this to happen effectively, right, you have to have control over your own domain name, the name resolution process. Okay, so that will govern how the identity is spread. this is relatively easy to achieve, right? Register hosts under self-jurisdiction, right? As the authoritative name server with the INA, and so on and so forth, right? But right, so the idea was the following, right? Here was the main idea. Suppose the address resolution, you have done the address resolution as follows, right? All queries for host S that originate in the US, right? That get IP addresses, let's say in subset 1, right? All queries from, let's say, China get addresses from subset 2, and those from Brazil get subset 3 addresses, right? Now, in case of DDoS attack, host S can selectively turn off traffic flows, say from Brazil, by doing doing two things, right? Tells the penultimate router to temporarily set addresses to subset 3 to null, right? That is quench addresses in subset 3. Mind you, this filtering is happening on the destination addresses, not the source addresses, right? Source address can be spoofed, right? The attackers can make it look as if the packet is coming from anywhere in the world, right? So filtering on source address is not possible, but by properly controlling the name resolution to spread your identity effectively, what we have achieved is the inversion, right? So now you can filter on destination address, and destination address is the one invariant parameter that cannot change. You cannot spoof the destination address, because if you do, the packet will go haywire, right? It will not reach the intended victim. Right? So therefore, you can quench your own addresses temporarily, right? So tells DNS server to return a null address if the algorithm lands upon address which is being quenched. That's some detail here, right? And the routes can be restored later, right? So the quenching is on destination address, not on source address, right? So in a sense, you control your own destiny. But this is not necessarily. So this is the protocol which is now old. This is not we quickly figured out how to improve it to substantially better performance and everything, right? And substantially simplify, and at the same time keep the same effect. So this is just for the sake of completeness, right? So the old protocol was end-to-end in the sense that each individual host took responsibility for spreading its own identity. Right? So for example, it registered a lot of its things with the DHCP server and so on and so forth. But then I realized that if you just do it instead of end-to-end, if you do this thing edge to edge, it fixes everything, right? Silver bullet solution to multiple problems, as explained here, right? So therefore, the idea is let the firewall handle address revealing, right? So it is difficult for individual hosts to acquire, release, and resolve and quench IP addresses dynamically, right? Because individual hosts are typically not allowed to talk to gateways or whatever, right? So it's better that you do it on a subnet, at least to begin with. Think of it as being done on the subnetwork basis, right? So in most organizations, right, the gateway at the edge performs NAT to hide the internal structure of the network today, anyway, right? This has been in practice for a long time, 10 years or so, I think. For instance, traffic from all defense contractor, like say Lockheed Martin, right, appear to come from a single IP address that the firewall chooses to expose to the external world. This they do at least for the purpose of, if nothing else, to hide the internal structure of the network from the external entities, right? So therefore, the idea that I started working with is, why not pool addresses and generalize network address translation? Right? This is tantamount to an individual virtualization, right? This is tantamount to indirection, or virtualization from end host perspectives. We call it blindfolding. And this diagram is a little outdated, so I might try for a second to check if I have a better diagram. I think I do. It's just a matter of looking for it, and that's what I was doing. Okay, so and this is where I think, okay, instead of this diagram, now the latest updated diagram is what I was showing here. So everybody can see, right? So what happens is, the main idea is that the real routable addresses, let's say here, right, X, organization X is a source organization, just for the sake of illustration, right? Where X could be, say, umbc.edu or whatever, right? For example. And what is done is the real routable addresses, IP addresses assigned to X. For example, in the case of UMBC, these would be all the addresses all the class subnet B addresses allocated to UMBC, right? They are pooled at this gateway. Okay, SIGX, right? Or I think I ended up calling it SIG, SIROs, SIRI, right? Okay, so SIRI stands for Spread Identity Resolver Internal. Okay, and that what it means will become clear in a second, right? So the idea is that these IP addresses are worth their weight in gold, really. You don't assign those IP addresses to the internal nodes. Internal nodes, you can either always keep them on private addresses, 192.168, or you could actually use any kind of address from outside on the inside network. I shall explain that in a minute. Right? But so these are the internal addresses, right, which are arbitrary and not and they're definitely distinct from the external IP addresses. Okay. So supposing a node Xi, right, wants to connect to some server at the address www.y.org, right? So what does typically happen? You send a DNS resolution query, right? So the idea is the first thing that needs to happen in the SI paradigm is that the name your machine, right, has at least on Unix in the resolve.conf file, right, et/etc/resolve.conf, there are entries, right, and that those machines are where your name resolution queries get directed by default. So it is very easy to set all your machines such that all your name resolution queries get sent to this server I call it SIRO, Spread Identity Resolver Outbound. Because because it is taking care of requests for connections that originate here and go out. That's why it is the outbound server. So the request gets sent here. And what this guy does is this guy, based on the actual address xi and the string that got used, right, the actual name www.y.org, and possibly other parameters such as time of day and so on and so forth, right, it picks an address, namely xi, to be eventually given to x. Okay, no. Okay, so let me think for a second. It picks a xi, right? It hashes it into xi IP access, right? So IP access is the external address that will be shown to the destination. So therefore, what it does is it creates that xi IP access, and theta is some kind of temporary address. That's not too important, right? So it creates a temporary entry for theta. Okay, and then what it does is that this box now, right, it must send the DNS query directly to the authoritative name resolution server for the destination domain, right? Unlike what happens in today's DNS protocol, right? Today's DNS protocol, you can hierarchically query, right? So this guy, this SIRI, does not need to store a whole bunch, right? So it can make a query to above UMBC. There might be whoever is UMBC's ISP, Verizon or whatever. It will be sent to Verizon. If Verizon doesn't know, it will send it to one level higher, L3 communications or whatever. Finally, it will go to the root DNS server that somebody maintains, right? It is easy to see that with today's technology, right, even if you were to memorize entire the authoritative name server for each individual IP address, is not more than a billion. That much memory, or few gigabytes, right? That's easily doable today. Actually, the number of organizations, right? There's a lot of addresses are clumped together, right? So it's not even a gigabyte either. Very easy to keep the list of all authoritative domain name servers in the entire namespace of IPv4, right? So suppose that is done, right, on this server. So it has the capability just by looking at the domain to figure out who is the authoritative server, right? It keeps that information it keeps up to date. Right? That's a very simple thing that people have to commit. That's the only infrastructure change you really need to implement spread identity on the source side. Period. You don't need anything more than this box with a little memory, right, and some NATing. Okay, once you do that, right, so it gives, okay, so it sends a DNS query where the source address appears as IP access, which is one of the addresses allocated to that organization, right? Real routable addresses. So that so the XI is replaced with IPXS and resolve www.y.org, right? That's the query that gets sent through the internet, right? So such a query then comes to organization Y, destination organization Y, right? So the same thing is being done at our destination organization. Namely, the real routable addresses are pooled at the gateway. They are never allocated to individual hosts, right? So this gateway this does so the functionality of the firewall and the gateway, right, is together done by this entity here, right, which I called spread identity gateway Y, which is a destination gateway. Okay. So it sends that IPXS and so it gets the thing to be resolved, right? So it sends it to some other server, right, which is the authoritative DNS server for organization Y, right? So it dynamically resolves one of the pooled addresses and a blind folding address lambda, right? So in other words, to Y it is going to show the blind folding address. So Y thinks, the destination thinks it is communicating with lambda, and the source X thinks it's communicating with this fictitious address Xi. I call that double blind folding, and the importance of that will become clear in a minute, right? Why do we do that? It will become clear in a second. So therefore, once it does that, right, then it creates NAT entries. What NAT entries? What is the meaning? It says, okay, you can use IPYD, which is one of the real routable addresses, right, pooled here at the destination. So therefore, okay, so okay, so step one, right, resolves one of the pooled addresses and creates appropriate NAT mappings. So then this DNS response is sent back, right? It comes back to this server, right? And okay, so once this guy makes sure that there is no error, right? That an address has actually been sent out and so on. That the message came back, and it has a valid address, right, from that domain. Then it simply removes, okay. See that theta, why it had to create, why do you think it had to create this temporary entry where theta is one of the actual address, internal addresses of this guy? Because somebody has to receive that request first, right? And because it is playing the blindfolding mechanism, right, it is employing. So the internal hosts have no clue. So this guy must be the one who actually accepts the DNS response. Make sure that there are no error flags or no special flags set, right? So therefore, to begin with, it sets its own entry, right? It's its own internal address. All it does is you can think of that as it either removes it or changes, right, that theta to xi. So here are the mappings, therefore, at the end of the day, right? XI thinks that it is talking to this virtual destination xi, okay, virtualized. And so whenever such a packet comes to this gateway, right, it substitutes one of the real routable addresses IPXS for the source, and IPYD, which it was given, which was written by the authoritative DNS for Y, right, for the destination address, and then the packet is sent out. It comes here, right? Now this guy, the NAT entry says that whenever you see, right, a packet, okay, here are the NAT entries. Okay, so whenever you see IPXS to IPYD, right, you should translate it as though it were coming from lambda and going to YJ, and then route it to internal node YJ. Right? And when this guy replies or sends anything, it appears as to coming from YJ, and this guy thinks that it is talking to this source lambda, right? Whenever you get this coming from this side, this gateway then translates it into IPYD as a source, IPXS as a destination, which comes here. And this gateway simply again takes this out, right, and makes it appear as though it is coming from xi, and the destination address is xi, and send it internally, right? So this is the double blinding, right? And so the NAT entries are simply deleted when you see when they see a FIN packet, right, on the TCP connection, or after a timeout for a UDP packet, right? That's the UDP could become a tricky issue, but in principle you understand how the connection is created, right? So this diagram explains how it happens, and it supersedes this diagram. This was a little older diagram, right? So what all does it say? Okay, so let's look at, it's too crowded a slide, I realize. So the idea is do not assign real routable IP addresses given by INA to internal hosts, but pool them to be dynamically assigned to connections as needed, right? Connections or even individual packets if need be. NAT both outgoing and incoming packets. See, in today's NATing, right, they NAT only the outgoing packets, right, not the incoming packets. With such address mappings at both IP, both the edge, right? IP addresses assigned to internal hosts can be arbitrary and totally independent of the IP addresses used externally. Realize that, right? Leads to enormous advantages and flexibility, right? Okay, so here are the typical steps that I have shown, right? So, for example, X, right? Let's say my machine here, photon.cs.umbc.edu, right? And the destination is the host Y. Let's say it's NSF, right? And I'm looking up CIC directorate nsf.gov, right? So my host sends a get host by name query, right? As I said, right? And then based on this, so the UMBC gateway, right? Spread identity gateway allocates one of the IP access, the addresses that UMBC has, and sends it to the NSF resolver. NSF's authoritative name resolver to return a numerical IP address for this name, right? So an M server of Y, in this case NSF, right? So SI gateway returns one of the pooled addresses IPYD and creates two mappings, as I said, right? IP access IPYD going inside should become lambda YJ for incoming packets, and IPYD and something that originates from YJ for destination lambda should be replaced with IPYD, and the lambda should be replaced with IP access for outgoing packets, right? This is called double blindfolding, right? So in other words, the rest of the world shrinks to whatever addresses lambda and xi, the gateways choose to expose the internal host to. Okay, so there is equivalent mapping that gets established at the source side gateway, right? Okay. From here on, XI is communicating with virtual address xi, and YJ thinks it is communicating with lambda. NAT entries are removed after seeing a FIN packet, right? This interaction for sure, but we leverage it in different ways, right? That's the point. So people will say, okay, what's the big deal? This has been known for a long time, right? Okay, so the first thing is to realize that the same real routable address can be used to support multiple connections to multiple hosts at the same time, right? For example, right, in response to a query from let's say my machine, right, to nsf.gov, SI gateway, let's say it returns the real address 1.2.3.4, correct? Next, in response to another query, let's say from let's say California, right, math.ucsantarbarbara.edu from California, for math.nsf.gov, it can return a different okay. The SI gateway can actually return the same numerical address, okay? So to me, it tells you send your packet to 1.2.3.4. To somebody in California, it also tells you send their packets to 1.2.3.4. How does it distinguish between the actual destinations from depending on the source, right? If it's going to 1.2.4, but it's coming from Maryland, it knows to send it to CISC. If it's same 1.2.3.4, but it's coming from UCSB, California, then it knows to send it to wherever that destination was, right? In this case, maths.nsf.gov, right? So therefore, now what is happening? The same address is supporting multiple connections at the same time, right? You can and the reverse can also be done, right? If 10 people request the address for cic.nsf.gov, NSF could give different addresses, right? So therefore, the reverse is also possible, right? The same works for outgoing connections as well, right? So this is for incoming connections, right? So the same address can support multiple hosts for incoming connections, as well as one host can also be simultaneously using multiple addresses also, right? So the same thing happens for outgoing addresses, right? It is not, first of all, realize that it is not necessary to have spread identity on the source side, right? Even spread identity by itself on the destination side offers a lot of advantages, But just for the sake of argument, let's assume that spread identity is also implemented on the source side. Then the same strategy works for all outgoing connections as well. If host, okay, so supposing if a host Y wants to talk to google.com, right? And and another host wants to talk to yahoo.com, then obviously they can the outgoing NATing can give them the same address, right? So the only you would think only problem comes if the same two hosts in the same subnet want to talk to the same host, namely Google, right? But in that, but never mind that Google is itself also playing the spread identity game, right? So I mean, there are ways around that. Okay? So therefore, so external addresses. Okay, so this is not that important a point, right? So double blindfolding, right? SI gateway intercepts. Okay, so there is an issue. So where does a double blindfolding help you, right? It helps you in two ways. What I'm saying is here that first of all, it makes the spread identity thing transparent to application caching, and the second thing is that it makes the routing possible. For instance, right? Okay. So what I was saying here was that since the internal addresses are arbitrary, right? Somebody can choose to actually use addresses really given to Google, right? To use on your own internal network. In such a case, what happens if somebody really wants to talk to Google? And that's where that XHAI comes in, right? Because that your node knows that as long as it doesn't return an address XHAI, which is real Google, there is no problem. As long as that XHAI is something that is external to your internally used namespace, the packet is going to come to the gateway, right? That's the second advantage, right? So the second advantage of that double blindfolding, you're understanding, right, is that it will let you arbitrarily use any addresses on the internal network, right, and without breaking the routing to the external world. So that's the second advantage. And the first advantage, okay, so let's look at it. So if you think about this for a minute, right, the number of simultaneous connections is actually unlimited, right? It's not just square, it's not just doubling, by the way. You would think, is the effect same as making the address space 64 bits? No, it's even better than that. It's pretty much unlimited, right? So therefore, the number of simultaneous connections supported could be unlimited, depending on the use granularity, right? So for example, the same pair of IP real routable addresses, right, could be supporting connections at the same time, right, in US, Europe, Asia, or at a finer granularity if you wish, right? As long as the translations at the edges, the NATing at the edges is done properly, this is always possible, right? So at some point, addresses start to loosely resemble frequencies of a CDMA cell, right? Just the same way the CDMA frequencies can be reused in non-adjacent cells, right? You can use the addresses, right, assigned to one part, and use it somewhere far away, right? As long as they don't touch each other, and then you are definitely doing the NATing at the edges. This starts to become reusable, right? This is practical plus commercially viable, right? Because why? Because currently most organizations had their internal structure anyway. That's okay. That's the first question. So why NAT? Because in other words, NAT is being used anyway. All that is happening is that they are not using the full power of NAT. How many NAT entries are there in tables? That's the second question people started asking, right? See, fundamentally, the number of connections, as long as the number of connections doesn't change, right? Number of NAT entries is not going to explode. It's the same as the NAT entries today. The only difference is that each NAT entry is slightly bigger, right? Maybe twice the size. That's not a big deal. I don't think so. What about creation, deletion? SI and NAT entries are self-clocking, right? Created upon the egress of DNS query and deleted after a fill packet or after a certain timeout period. Right? So they can support multiple customers without requiring more IP addresses, right? So that's one of the big advantages, right? See, so it's statistical address multiplexing now, right? You're literally statistically multiplexing the available addresses. So they can charge a small fee for participating in the address pool, right? And it could be they could market it saying that we log all attempts to tamper with your home box, right? We protect your kids from it, whatever, right? And so they can sell a lot of add-on services, for example, DDoS protection, right? Providing packet syncs, trace back when requested. Okay, in other words, it appears that SI gateway implementation should be a commercially viable prospect for the router makers. And this benefit is, by the way, incidental. Namely, what the issue that the IPv4 address crunch, in other words, I am saying, is completely gone. You see that, right? Once you have the ability to support any number of connections, right? The address crunch is gone. You don't need to worry about IP addresses getting exhausted. So, but however, the reason we introduced pooling was to large number of addresses available to dynamically spread the identity. It was not at all in my mind that by doing this, the fact that IP address crunch would be completely resolved was just an afterthought. Right? Original motivation was just to make a lot of addresses available. And because the first criticism of the original thing was, oh, see, if individual host is responsible for doing this, right, then the first question that the reviewers are going to ask is, oh, but IPv4 address space is running out. How can each node get multiple addresses? Right? Pooling completely solves that issue, right? Not only that, it resolves the IPv4 crunch. That problem is just gone, right? So it also, in my thinking, it really does wonders for abnormal behavior detection, right? And that's what we'll show next, right? Okay, so the main idea then in spread identity, right, is to leverage these SINAD entries as dynamic flow markers or tags, as dynamic access control tokens, right? So you can detect abnormal behavior extremely fast by simple IP level source destination pair matching, which I call token matching, right? Mount a multi-level, multi-prong, highly effective DDoS defense, right? Even aggressive defense, aggressive, right? You can redirect the attack bots to attack each other. That funny thing I'll show you later. So it simplifies traceback at the same time, substantially simplifies control plane. Because why should it simplify? Because the destination address itself is a flow marker now, right? The router is guaranteed to look at destination address, if not source address. If the destination address is itself the flow marker, it should simplify the control plane enormously, right? Okay, so no access or egress past the SI gateway without a token. If it is implemented on the source side, there is no access or egress past a spread identity gateway without a token implies overall security is actually improved. Okay, so here is. Okay, so let's look at, so this is originally I did this for this application, okay. Let's focus on the DDoS problem. How spreading your identity helps you completely resolve the DDoS attack threat, right? So in a typical DDoS attack, right, an attack bot gets an address from the victim server S, right, distributes it to many, right, so thousands of other attack bots, right, and at a chosen time they all send data requests, right, so to overwhelm the server. So the goals are to block genuine users from accessing the server. To the extent possible, overload the server memory, CPU, and cripple it or crash it. And if none of the above works, at least clog the bandwidth by sending large volume of traffic. And accordingly, so we classify the DDoS attacks based on what they target and show how to protect against all of them, right? So the type 1 attack is is something that is not distinguishable from a genuine overload, right? This is the worst type of attack, right? Bots. So here, you really, I mean, this is not distinguishable from a genuine overload, right? So everybody abides by the rules. Right? That means everybody gets tokens. So in other words, what I didn't mention here, maybe the slides need to change a little bit, is the fact that unless you make a name resolution query, there is no, you cannot, that NAT entry is not created at the destination, right? And so unless you make a name resolution query, you cannot contact your intended destination. Now, therefore, people immediately started asking you, does this not really increase the DNS traffic, right? And we'll look at that issue. I mean, everything has been thought through, right? And the answer is no. And we'll get to that issue later. But the important thing to realize is that in my paradigm, therefore, right, unless the NAT entry is what I call the token, right? So unless you create a token at the destination gateway, you're not going to get access to your target, right? And mind you, this is independent of whether the spread identity mechanism is implemented on the source side or not, right? The destination by itself can decide to do that. Unless you make a fresh query and I give you a fresh address and create that NAT entry, namely access control token, you cannot access any internal resource. Plain and simple, right? So therefore, okay, so type 2 are resource consumption attacks, right? So tie up memory buffers, whatever, right? TCP SYN floods, and so on and so forth. Type 3 are bandwidth clogging. Right? So these are second worst in terms of severity. The third ones are bandwidth clogging, right? So in other words, there is something, okay, everybody has not taken a token, in other words, in these type of attacks, right? Everybody is not necessarily taken a token. They are trying to use old tokens, right? Old resolved addresses or something. And so these are very easy to neutralize, type 2 attacks. So as a last gasp, what do the attackers do? They try to bring your link down, right? The incoming link, right? And so this is where you use the quench your own addresses defense, right? So to tell the penultimate router, I'm getting too much traffic. For the next 20 minutes, right? Ground these 5 out of my 20 addresses or whatever, right? And that way you try to remain alive, right? Type 4 is attack against DNS server itself, right? Then the reviewer started saying, oh, what about the DNS server itself, right? Because, okay, so realize that token at the destination gateway is an ultra-fast abnormality trigger, right? Even if SI is implemented only at the destination side, it enables extremely fast detection of abnormal behavior, right? Okay. Traffic does not get past SI gateway and reach the server without SI entry, right? Okay. So that means all the bots that got the DNS address without the DNS query will have no tokens, right? So their packets can therefore be filtered off, right, at the gateway itself without ever reaching the target. So here is the deal, right? So see, these tokens also enable ultra-fast detection of botnets and so on. Because see how would a normal client typically behave, right? If you don't know the address, you do a get host by name, right? And then if I tell you use this address, right, then you are going to follow up a data request with that address typically, right? So for example, right, XSI, right, sends a name resolution request, right, gets an IP address, right, and this creates a token at the gateway. And SI sends a data connection request to address IPYD, right, and so on and so forth. So, but okay, if only there is a name resolution request with no data connection request, then there is a chance that maybe the original guy that sent the request is a main attack bot, right? That it got an address and it wants to distribute that address to thousands of other nodes. There's a possibility, right? So how do you detect this kind of activity? So if a token expires without a connection, without any data request, if that happens, there's a possibility that somebody is planning a DDoS attack on you, right? Unsolicited query, a data request which is not preceded by a token, right? So for instance, if I just told you to use address number 7 for me, and you still try to use address number 5, there's something funny. You know, why? I just told you to use address number 7, right? So source address does not match or appear in any token, right? So that tells you that this guy's, the application is caching is happening or something is happening, but it tells you abnormal behavior. Or otherwise sends data request to another that Y has, right? So the source actually knows what all it might have remembered or looked for over a period of time that, oh, I have also seen you work with that address. So it might directly try to contact you on that address. Right? All that is fail, that will fail because I'm dynamically giving out addresses, right? So this works even if it's deployed only on the destination side. So action by bots, right? So therefore, how can you make a successful DDoS attack on this guy? Right? If every bot that wants to attack, unless they get a distinct token, this is going to fail. So if they try to get tokens, right, what happens? Therefore, a attack will therefore must manifest itself as a query or a flurry of the DNS requests, right? So that's how you track them, right? So action by bots, flurries of DNS queries can be easily detected. So the first line of defense is you rate limit the number of DNS resolution responses. You see, if you know the capacity is can support no more than 1,000 connections at a time, and I see that there is a request for million connections, right? I will never give out more than 1,000 addresses, right? So that's the first line of defense. The rate limiting is fundamental, right? I mean, if you rate limit to get right? So this is the first and the most fundamental line of defense. Right? Once you rate limit, no more than that many sources can connect to you. Right? That's the first fundamental, which is enabled by token matching, right? Fast token matching. So to get past, so each bot must make a DNS query. Therefore, to look like a genuine client, they must subject themselves to a DNS query. The fundamental difference is rate limit the number of DNS responses. For example, right, if the server capacity is less than 1,000 connections per second or whatever, right, to rate limit the DNS responses to less than that many, right. So access requests are either delayed or return an error code, right. This way, server can limit the number of clients that can connect to it, right, and this handles type 1 attacks. Server rate limits the number of connections so that it can survive rather than crash. But people say that if genuine people get crowded out, right, in this type of attack, right, the attacker has won. And yeah, sure, I will not allow more than 1,000 connections. But if all the 1,000 connections are going to stupid bots, I have still lost, right? I have still disabled I have still made the service unavailable to genuine people. Right, so there is a pretty simple solution to that as far as I can tell. Right. Okay, so therefore, whenever you see such a big flurry, right, you can start making the requester go through some kind of a CAPTCHA type test, right, and you can assume that a genuine client at some point there is going to be some human interaction at some point. That's fair to assume, because why? Because what you're interested in is the genuine people who want to buy something at your website, typically, right? So it is fair to assume that at least the first query or the important query will have some human involvement, right? So if you assume that, and whereas the DDoS server attack that is orchestrated by bots is all done in software. Right? The bots suddenly start attacking, right? So therefore, they will not be able to pass a CAPTCHA, right? So therefore, whenever you see a flurry of DNS requests, you can redirect them, right, to another server where the end user is presented with some kind of challenge, CAPTCHA type, right? And those who fail, you know that's some kind of automated traffic, right? You can just filter it out. And arm your Bloom filters, let's say, right, and which are the filters at ingress, right? So so that is a way. That's how you prevent crowding out genuine users. Now, some people started then arguing that but there are important things like backups and so on, right? That can happen across the network. My answer to that is pretty simple, right? You can have specific authentication tags and channels for those, first of all, and you don't want to start a backup in prime time when you expect several people to be logging in and buying your stuff, right? So it is fair to assume that that the CAPTCHA will be able to solve this problem. I mean, so genuine users will not be crowded out this way, right, by throwing a little more challenge. Okay, so extremely fast detection and prevention of type 2 attacks, right? So rate limiting dispense the DNS response plus a challenge response test effectively neutralizes the worst type of attacks, right? Where the bots try to masquerade as genuine clients by appearing to behave normally, by getting their tokens, right? So to circumvent the rate limits, right, and challenge response tests, the bots might try to send several types of query floods, right, without bothering to get a token. Right? They said, okay, I know you have one address, I'm just going to flood you with data on that address, right? So this thing, you just filter it out right at the gateway. There is no token, right? It will token mismatch and can be filtered off at the IP level. It never reaches TCP or higher level, right? It doesn't even reach the target machine, right? So ultra fast detection and neutralization of type 2 attacks. Right, so now, next possibility is to clog the input bandwidth, right? They'll send you so much data that they'll clog your input bandwidth, they'll clog your link. So these are handled by selectively quenching your addresses, right? For example, in the previous example, all addresses exposed to say Brazil could be quenched, right? To quench an address, the SI gateway does two things. Tells the next hop upstream router to set routes corresponding to quench addresses to null, right? The routes can be redirected later. And the quenched addresses are not doled out in response to DNS queries, right? Obviously. Okay, so again, there to note that bandwidth clogging attacks are more asymmetric, right? Or rather more symmetric. The attackers need to generate a large volume, right? Now, in a typical, so the typical asymmetry between upload and download, right, implies that download speeds are usually bigger, right? What do you as a user get, right? You get downloads of megabit or 15 or whatever megabits, right? But upload is much smaller, right? Upload is only 5 megabits, right? So that asymmetry actually helps, at least the individual customers, right? Small mom and pop customers with small links, right? Their download speed is much bigger than the upload speed their attackers are going to face. Because if they have commandeered, machines at 5,000 homes, everybody's upload capacity is that much smaller, right? Okay. So plus if the thing is full duplex, right? If the connection to the internet, right, of the victim node to the internet is full duplex, the output bandwidth remains uncluttered. Keep that in mind, right? All the bots can do is clutter your input bandwidth. The output bandwidth remains uncluttered. So the last guess, now the attacks against DNS server, right? You'll say, okay, why don't we just kill your DNS resolver, right? So they are easy to defend because understand that DNS server itself sits behind the firewall, right? And a set of addresses can be reserved to spread the identity of DNS server itself. You can reserve a set of addresses, right? And even in today's thing, right? If you do a whois query for Yahoo, right? Yahoo has at least 5 different name servers, Yahoo 1, Yahoo 2, whatever, right? So input link, bandwidth link can be attacks can be handled by quenching name server identities, right? You see that, right? Name server also has an identity. So it's like Yahoo 1, Yahoo. You can have Yahoo 5,000, right? And spread the identity that way, right? So for example, in case of Yahoo, okay, it could temporarily have the penultimate routers, let's say to name server 2 and name server 4 to null, and let's say the address NS3 is the one that remains functional, right? Any questions?
I'll have to go to
Oh, okay, that's fine. Okay, so that's that, right? Okay, so the only thing left now is to attack the SI gateway itself or the penultimate router. Right? So SI gateway is controlled by the ISP. The guy has to bring down a full-fledged ISP router or gateway, which is a much harder task, right? It's not that easy to bring down a gateway as compared to bringing down a machine, right? So this is raising adversaries' effort level substantially. So this is success, right? Attacker cannot touch anything inside the SI gateway or firewall. All it can try to do is bring down the penultimate router or the edge gateway, right? Okay, so here is a funny thing, right? If you are sure, if supposing you see a name flurry of name server request, right? And from past experience, you're sure that this is an attack network at work, right? What can you do? If I'm sure you're an attack bot, right? And he's an attack bot. When you make a query for a fresh token, I'll give you his address. And for him, I'll give you your address, right? And so you'll kill each other, leave me alone, right? When I presented it in the conference, they were laughing, they were not really, this is radical, but it could be done in principle, right? This is your revenge, right? But even better form of this is what, right? Return you your own address. You're going to get really mad. What can you do though? You can do nothing, right? You see what's happening. Reflection. Return the bot its own address, right? So what happens? So it is attacking itself, right? The traffic never leaves the thing, right? So the hackers are not stupid. They'll figure it out eventually. But at least one generation, right, will definitely get fooled by this, right? Until they figure it out, right? The reflection attack will work. And of course, I don't think anybody is that smart. If I start giving you somebody else's address, then for the attackers to coordinate, it will be much harder, right? Because then you will have to have knowledge of how many other machines you have compromised. That is dangerous in the sense that if somebody in a traceback, right, figures out that and gets hold of this machine, it's like giving away the identities of all other machines. So there are other issues, right? Why attackers may not want to do that. So therefore, either way, right, you can make their life very difficult, right? You just give them arbitrary. You're better still, right? ISPs can do this for money, right? They can have special hosts, right? Okay, that I mentioned, right? Honeypots, right? Tickle TCP. Okay, so DNS response, right? Instead of letting them kill each other, right? You can direct their connections to a specialized host or machine, right? Whose TCP stack is deliberately written in such a way as to trickle them, right? To the best of my knowledge, no attacker goes to this extent of changing the TCP stack on the machine that they commandeer, right? If my machine is broken into, and somebody is going to use it for DDoS attack, they still are not going to go and change the TCP stack. That will be too much of overload work on them, right? So what you can do is these honeypot machines, right? What you do is you keep the bot connected, right? You don't give the bot the impression that its attack is actually successful, right? So what you do is send it bare minimum trickle so as not to drop the connection, right? For example, you deliberately advertise the zero windows. The TCP has a zero window thing, right? So if you suddenly advertise a zero window at the TCP level, right, the other machine goes into exponential backoff. The connection is still there, but it goes into exponential backoff, right? So this is the best way, right? You think that the bots, those are not human beings. Those are scripts, right? They make a request, you send them to honeypot. They think they are attacking, right? And actually they're crawling. All they're doing is waiting exponential backoff, right? So attackers, the bots will have to collaborate, right, to figure out that this is what is going on. Now the attackers will have to combine data from several nodes, right? That's a much higher responsibility, right? So you're raising the level of work that adversary has to do all the time, right? That's what you can do in the name of security, right? There is no guarantee that it will. That should definitely thoughts more script kiddies or whatever, right? Not kiddies, right? KIDDIES. So alternative to refresh. So for a fee, the ISP could provide packet sinks in physically separate locations to trap bot traffic for analysis and whatever, right? Redirection to such physically separate packet sink has added unclogging victim nodes input bandwidth, right? Okay, so activating identity traps, right? What do I mean by that? Forcing the bots to follow an identity trail. So you successively keep on giving distinct type destination addresses, and the attackers will keep following that address, right? If they want to continue to attack you. So default policy might be to give out a new destination address for each new query, right? From the same source, even from. But when under an attack, right? The same SI gateway now starts giving out the same address, right? Thereby herding all the attack connections onto one or two addresses, namely herding them into a corner of the namespace, address space, right? And why do you do that? Because then when you kill that one address, a lot of connections get dropped at the same time, right? Those addresses can be quenched, right? So this is herding at all the attack bots in a corner of the namespace, right? Literally like ships, you herd them into a corner of namespace and then ground those connections, so they all get killed, right? Whoever gets to token mismatches, right, on such bait value or destination address gives themselves away as belonging to a cluster of bots, right? Identifying bot and clustering bots is very fast if you do this, right? Oh, successive attackers are more automatically downgraded. Why? Suppose smart get tokens and then try to masquerade, right? Challenge response and screen error. Okay, so now they can be entered into filter banks, right? So not only is the attack neutralized, right? The next time the same bots try traffic, they will be filtered off the IP level Bloom filters, right? That downgrades the bandwidth clogging them to bandwidth clogging type attack the next time they try. Right? See, the point is once they might fool you at best. Right? But the next time you have some memory, right? The next time they try to do the same thing, you're going to be much better off, right? you are going to quickly downgrade their attack to bandwidth clogging attack. Consecutive attacks from the same set of source addresses are progressively downgraded into lesser and lesser effective categories, right? So since attack, each punch strengthens the firewall, right? So inaction by bots also gives an attack under making, right? For example, token expires without a query, and the query was from OK. So you see what is going on, right? Supposing you are the bot, you made one query, right, to get a token, and then you distributed it to 10,000 other guys, and then attacked. Then I know that you are not only I know who those other guys are, I also know that you are the lead bot, right? So action gives it away, inaction also gives them away, right? Okay, so I used to joke that this is better than stock market, right? It's like, whenever the stocks go up, you can make money, right? And when it goes down, you can also make money by shorting, as they say, right? So it's just like that, right? If bots take actions, they'll lose. If they don't take much action, even then they'll lose, right? Okay, so that's, I hope that has convinced you that you can, if you take your own destiny in your own hands and you are nimble about projecting your own identity, dynamically shrinking and expanding it, then DDoS attacks can be effectively neutralized. That was one of the big, I don't know that there is any more effective way of doing it than this, in fact. Unfortunately, for some reason I had a lot of resistance to publishing this. Partly because I didn't have the prowess to actually, they would say, okay, give enough experimental data, do this, do that, right? And if by mistake you leave somebody's name out, right, then they get mad saying, oh, you didn't refer to my paper. That's the most childish pet peeve, right? But okay, the same method, right, also makes traceback very easy. Now let's look at that. How does that happen, right? So here is typically what happens in a thing, right? So here is origin host, right? So they typically go through a lot of stepping stones, right? A lot of machines that they have commandeered without people knowing about it. And then finally they initiate the attack, right? Through some last hope machines, right? And the idea is so it's difficult if you are the target, right? Especially for single packet attacks, right? That the DoD faces all the time. They get this malicious packet and they have no clue where it really came from. And because with source address spoofing, once it has gone past like 5, 6, 7 gateways, you really have no clue where it really came from. None of the gateways could be cooperative, right? So therefore, look at this, right? There are some characteristics that a method should have. See, end host packet auditing is bad, right? So it's like your machine and my machine, if they are the targets of attacks, right? Then they should not be the ones doing the auditing, because all the logs can be deleted, right? If your or my machine gets compromised. Ordinary hosts may not be equipped to your and my machines are typically not equipped to answer back traceback queries, right? So end host packet auditing should be avoided. So what people try to do is network packet logging, right? Brute force. Routers log all packets. So this is ridiculous, right? Scalability nightmare, right? Right? If you have to log all packets, it's just a scalability nightmare. Forget it. That approach is fundamentally wrong, right? Because adversary can obfuscate by encryption, chafing and winnowing, inserting random delays, right, in the chain of command. All packet logging can retrieve in such cases is connection history. Right? It goes against the future trend where more and more data will go on through encrypted channels, right? So what are you going to do by logging the packets? They tell you pretty much nothing, right? It's just all the payloads are encrypted. So so it cannot depend on end host, right? Packet content analysis is ridiculous. You don't want to start trying to dig into the content of the packet. It's difficult. It should be scalable, right? That means the routers should be left alone also, the core routers. And the SI traceback satisfies all these three properties, right? So that's the second big advantage. So first of all, understand that SINet entry is a record of communications, right? So if the spread identity mechanisms are implemented on both sides, understand that there is no egress or ingress across SI gateway without a token. Right? That means every packet delivered belongs to connection whose peers are listed in the SINAD entries, correct? So therefore, simply logging the SINAD entries captures a full record of who wanted to talk to whom and what time. Right? And so, okay, so there is no need to touch individual packets or their payload, for one thing, first. Only SI gateways do the logging. That means logging is not dependent upon end hosts. Intermediate routers are left alone. See, the core of the internet should be left alone for efficiency, right? This is as accurate as network packet logging because all they can do is record the connections anyway, right? So we zoom in directly on that. Just just that NAT entry captures the essence, right? Logging at both ends. This is the other interesting. It's like double entry bookkeeping, right? Inherently safer. So even if logs at one end disappear or are subverted, right, the other host has its logs too, right? So in fact, that could be used to periodically match the logs and see if somebody is misbehaving, right? Suspect connections. Okay, if you get suspect connections, you can then have more information. How long it lasted, how many packets were sent, and so on and so forth. Understand that even if SINAD is deployed only at the destination, and it still simplifies the traceback a lot. You see that, right, Chris? Because why? Because there is no, you cannot even connect without getting a fresh address, correct? So wherever how do you get a fresh address? You have to send a DNS query. The response has to come back somewhere, right? And if you cannot get that response, you cannot get the fresh address. That means the entity that receives the DNS response must be under your control, right? So in other words, to be able to even connect to you, they must give up the identity of the last hop zombie node that they have commandeered, right? This is a distinct advantage. See, they necessarily have to expose at least the launch point, because otherwise you don't get a fresh address, right? If you don't get a fresh token, who are you going to attack? Your attack is meaningless, right? So therefore, the last hop node is necessarily exposed. That's a big advantage for traceback, right? At least you're guaranteed the first path right off the bat. So the second tool is token expiry time, right? So therefore, see, whenever you create a token, right, you have an expiry time with it. So you can play with it, right? In the beginning, your expiry time might be big. But then to induce the attacker to do more and more activity, right? You can start squeezing that time slowly, right? And so now you can, so now you repeat, you make the attacker repeat that action, right? So it's doing more things. Now you can keep track of who is sending the name resolution query, for example, right? You see that? So if the attacker realizes what is going on, right? Typically, if you look at this chain, right, the attackers are not stupid. What they will do is they'll introduce random delays, right? So in face of encryption, all you can do is you can, let's say, once you know that this is stepping stone, right? How do you trace back? You keep looking at the traffic, and all you can do is cause-effect relationships. So if a packet here causes a packet here, then you know that this is the connection, right? And that kind of analysis is the attackers try to defeat that kind of analysis, right? By introducing random delays. Now, once you make your token expiry time smaller and smaller, those delays have to be squeezed out, right? Otherwise that token will expire, right? And so therefore the attacker will have to start squeezing out those delays, making your causality analysis easier, right? That's the second thing you can play with, right? Okay, token expiry time, right? You get the idea behind that. Yeah. So adapting includes both relaxing, right, to tempt the attacker to sending, okay, as well as tightening, right? So there are some other possibilities, right, that are not available to unless you play this spread identity game. For example, right, even if this is implemented only at the destination, right, it enables yet another new mechanism which I call proactive traceback, right? For example, supposing the target is the Department of Defense web server, right? And the suspected attacker is in the US, but the apparent address, right, they make it appear as though it is coming from Europe, right? So now the DoD could return an address of one of its sites in Europe and sensitize any sniffers that it may have on the links between US and Europe to scan for packets to that specific destination address, right? That DoD just doled out, right? So in other words, so next time they make a query, they might deliberately give an address in Australia, right? And then sensitize, so the only entity who is going to use that address is the attacker, because that's the address you gave, doled them out, right? So in that sense, see, this is a proactive this thing, right? You're making them chase, in other words, a trail of identities around the world, in the hopes of exposing their foot whatever, their trails. So obviously, combining the three tools as required together, right, with forensic can substantially improve traceback. Even if traceback episode fails, if one traceback episode fails, right, it is likely to generate more forensic data than the corresponding case without spread identity, right? Whether destination identity is static, which is like a literally sitting duck, which is like a sitting duck. So I joke that spread identity gives a sitting duck the ability to fly, right? Forcing the attackers to chase it, thereby increasing the chance that the attackers will stumble across some tripwire, right? So if, on the other hand, if the spread identity is actually implemented at both ends, then traceback is trivial, right? What is there in the traceback then? Because there is no access or egress, right? Unless you take permission from the source end also, right? So then that is pretty simple, right? Then you can quench the flow off right at the source gateway itself. So see how, in other words, filtering of unwanted flows is very easy, right? If the edge gateways are cooperating, it's pretty much the end of story, right? I mean, you don't, go ahead.
If they don't cooperate, then there's no communication anyway.
Yeah, you protect yourself. Network resources may get consumed. You are not able to quench it off right at the source, but you are protected, right? You can protect yourself. That's the idea. So SINAT logs are abnormal. I understand that they can be thought of as abnormality detectors, right? Discrepancy between source and destination logs can detect attempts to subvert the logs, right? Periodic scanning of logs to identify tokens that expire without data exchange and cross-correlating such things can discern larger bot clusters, for example, right? Correlating the log, okay, there are so many things you can do, right? Once you have the logs on either side, right? It opens so many other, I mean, the number of possibilities is quite large, right? And there are some other uses of these logs, right? So sometimes I used to, again, joke saying that the logs are worth their weight in gold, right? Advertisers will have premium for accessing those logs, right? Because the SI gateway is now a barrier beyond which the advertisers cannot really see, right? So all the cookies based on IP addresses will fail. So the Walmarts and Best Buys, they want to know what actual host and who was the buyer, right? So what these guys can start doing is that they'll tell so they can tell you that if you pay me something, right? If I'm the ISP, I'll tell you if you pay me something, I'll protect your privacy. If you don't want to pay, then I'll turn around and tell Walmart that, in case you want the identity of this guy, I can sell it to you. Right? So they can literally make it. They can turn around both sides and then ask money, right?
But is that necessary since the advertiser can just leave a cookie on the host machine?
Say that again? Oh, yeah. No, but see, so anything that is IP address based will fail though, you realize that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So unless you go and make another connection, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they trying to proactively track you down, right, and send you stuff.
Mm-hmm.
There should be some dent on that, right? But you're right, I mean, yeah, if they leave the cookies on the host machine, right? In fact, your book mentions that cookies is all that is an encrypted thing that takes disk space on your computer. It's of no use, so you should get into the habit of deleting all cookies after every session or whatever. Okay, so there is that. You look at this, right? If these logs are truly maintaining a history of who wanted to talk to whom at what time, it is very useful for capacity planning, right? You can see like what is the expected traffic, right? Trend analysis, capacity planning, right? The logs are valuable. Long-term archival, right? Succinct history of connections. So trend analysis, right? Okay, so what are the other benefits? The control plane is substantially simpler, right? Only source and destination gateways are needed to collaborate and filter process flows. Intermediate nodes need not participate at all. And even if they do, see the big strength is that routers are meant to filter and act on destination addresses, right? Even more so than source addresses. Since I'm using the destination address itself as a dynamic token to mark or tag a flow, the processing or filtering of flows is necessarily very simple, right? All you do is you look for the destination address, correct? Okay, so therefore, reflected and non-routable addresses in response to a DNS query could be overloaded with a signal, right, of different level for throttling. For example, right? So destination could signal thus, right? If resolved address is equal to source address, for example, it might mean, right, block that source temporarily. You understand what I'm saying, right? That particular node. Oh, this guy has been offending me too much. Just block that. Right? Returning, let's say something this, right? Stronger choke signal. Block all connections, right? If it returns 0.0.0 block DNS block connections as well as DNS queries, right? So there could be a lot of signals. Right? The address you return is a variable, right? What you return itself can be used as a signal to the source side SI gateway, right? To take different actions. That's what is being said. Assumes communication between SI gateways and authenticated are tamper-proof, right? Which is it? Overall security is improved, right? So therefore, so for example, right, you lose all the stealthy port scans and all, they're just gone, right? Because unless you make why do you want to advertise yourself? If you want to make a port scan, right? Because see, it's not as if, so you have to receive the data from the scan somewhere, right? So for that, you'll have to expose your own address, right? So it's not even in your advantage, right, to get to do a port scan, because you're exposing yourself, right, or one of the zombie hosts to learn even something about. So first of all, to even learn something about your victim, you have to expose something. That's one of the big things, right? So this is the big thing, right? Destination address itself acts like a flow marker. So therefore, that is a big thing, and the routers are made to actually in hardware to filter that. What more could you ask for, right? Overall security is improved, right? See, there are so many things, right? Compromising end hosts is easy, but that will get you nowhere now, right? Because there is no egress or access or egress beyond the SI gateway. So now you would want to compromise an SI gateway, really, to have full effect, right? Now that is a lot harder task, right? Because presumably a gateway is being monitored, right? If my computer fails, nobody notices, but if the UMBC gateway fails, everybody will be waking up shouting, right? Oh, something has gone wrong. So therefore, those gateways are, first of all, not all users have access to them. They are well monitored, hopefully, right? So it will be a lot easier to make sure that they don't get compromised. Individual machines are a lot easier to compromise than gateways, typically, right? So that's the other thing, right? So this is the other big thing, right? See, you should realize that anonymity is enhanced big time, right? Edge to edge, okay, so here, how do you see? Forget this checking, and there are so many things, right? We should move on, and okay, so let's look at this, right? So here is the deal, right? Let's get back to this slide again, right? No, it was not this. Where did I insert? Yeah, okay, so here is the deal, right? So if you look at the trends, right? Designers of protocols simply have this urge to uniquely tag everything. Look at, so way back when IPv4 was created, they thought 32 bits are enough, right? A billion, they thought, oh really? They really didn't ever dream that internet would be the de facto communication backbone of the whole world, right? So by the time they created Ethernet, it had gone up to 48 bits. Now IPv6, they want to make it 128 bits, right? So I say, why don't we go to 256 bits once and for all? What is sacrosanct about 256? Well, it turns out that 2 raised to 256, right, is way bigger than the number of molecules on planet Earth. Which, again, I joke here. I like to joke once in a while so that I don't go to sleep, right? Quite often, actually. Planet ocean, which we mistakenly call Earth, right? 3/4 of the Earth is water. So in that case, right, each entity could have its own address range throughout the conceivable life of that entity, right? And still that address space would not get exhausted. By the way, as an exercise, I think the number of molecules on planet Earth, I think it turns out to be 2 raised to 180 or something. 2 raised to 256 is way bigger than 2 raised to 180, right? So even if each entity lived, see, billion and all is not that big as you think, right? Even if each entity lived multiple billion years, you could still give each entity, right, so many addresses that they'll never get exhausted, right? So supposing the internet naming address, internet agency went to 256-bit addresses and gave everybody like you and me, let's say they came to me, right, and said, okay, these are addresses that you use for your own, purely for your own use. Nobody else can use them. I should refuse it. Why? Yeah, they are, because it's the exact antithesis of anonymity, right? If I want to be anonymous, I would rather deliberately share a relatively small pool of IP addresses with a lot of peers or crowds, for crowds like anonymity, right? So the routing table in core, so the other thing is if really you started using the 2 raised to 256 combinations arbitrarily, the core routers have to remember all those routes, right? You'll die. I mean, there is no way. The routing tables in core routers would explode, making routing impossible. You just cannot do that, right? So the fundamental issue is translation of namespaces. We'll get back to it, right? Whenever you are translating names into names, spread identity is a principle, and we'll come back to that in a minute, right? But so the last big advantage I see is that this spread identity can give you crowds plus, you have heard of the onion routing, right? Onion routing, you must have heard of it, right? So it can give you crowds plus Tor-like anonymity in a hardware box, namely the router. See, the key here is that you make the mapping between the identities of internal hosts or resources, right, and the IP addresses, right? The mapping is deliberately made to appear many to many, right? To the observer on either side of the gateway, right? Because of double blind folding, right? So now only the gateway knows the underlying one-to-one mappings, right? So if the gateway does not reveal or output the NAT entries, it is not possible to identify with certainty who is connected to whom, correct? Many to many. What is the meaning of many to many mapping? It's not invertible, right? You could be connected to anyone on this side, right? Plus, there is the issue that two such gateways in series is it equivalent to the mixed-net what do you call it? Mixed-net primitive used in cryptology, right? This is a technical question that I have to answer, but at least intuitively it appears that when you take 2 such SI gateways and put them in series, right, you have what is equivalent to a mixed net. By the time you come out here, the thing has gotten so thoroughly mixed, right, because of many to many mappings, that you really have no clue of which line on this side is connected to which line on that side, right? So therefore, you realize that if DNS queries and responses were encrypted, right, and the spread entity is extensively deployed, right, so that even if somebody finds out the resolved address, right, it's meaningless, right? Why? Because if the addresses are truly dynamically allocated, right, you know that I just got returned the address something. If you try to query what that address is, it's meaningless, because you don't have a token, right? So if their packets go nowhere since the token was not created in your name, right? So it's not going to go anywhere. So the big thing is, so if the router manufacturers could incorporate SI gateway at that, right? And so first of all, realize that so the router makers, right? Like this is my thing. After the patents all get approved, one of the first things I intend to do is take it to Cisco or whatever, Juniper, and tell them that you can sell these to like Swiss banks, right, or people who value anonymity a lot, right? You can tell them this is an anonymizing gateway, right? It will completely mix things, so it's difficult to tell who is talking to whom. Right, so the upshot is that if these mechanisms were in place or were to be phased in quietly without making too much noise, right, then the protocol would have been built from ground up like that, right? So that anonymity would have been part of the protocol right from the get-go, and then big brothering would be impossible. Right? See, like for example, China or in Iran, they seriously control. The people there cannot just connect to the outside because they at the network layer they can put a stranglehold. Right now, if the data is all encrypted, and the addresses are also meaningless, right? Then where are they going to cache you, right? So big brothering will become very hard, if not impossible. Now there is some, so that's in a sense, no, let freedom ring true for all, right? But so you could argue that by the same token, right? If there are two terrorists who are using the internet, it will benefit them also. That is true. But I would think that the advantage of where somebody cannot systematically strangle a whole bunch of people is probably a lot more advantageous, I think, in the balance. And so I also think there is a connection to the QoS in this following sense, right? See, DNS query and response sets the NAT entries, right, at the edge gateways. So think of if this is being done by one or more ISPs in series, right? What is happening as the query goes, right, and comes back? It is creating NAT entries. This is exactly like circuit switching, right? What happens in circuit switching, right? There is first thing that the probe is sent, right, and then it comes back, setting the translations in all the switches, right? That's exactly what is happening. So therefore, this mechanism also has some elements of circuit switching in it, right? Even though it's a packet switch network, right? So also realize that you can starve something of bandwidth by not giving it an address for a long time, right? Or if you give it multiple addresses, then see, you can fool the. For example, right? Many guys say, okay, you cannot download anything more than you cannot simultaneously be downloading more than 2 or 3 things at a time, right? And typically those kind of throttles are based on IP addresses. You can easily fool them with all of this, right? So in other words, addresses themselves start to become like the currency, right, or the tokens, right? So like bandwidth, right? So this is therefore a connection to quality of service, right? So then in wrapping up the last few slides, all the benefits are in addition to the ones that are presented in the prior literature, right? So indirection is therefore in summary, right? Indirection is a very powerful principle, right? Indirection, see, star is what? Pointer to a pointer. Therefore, it is a quintessential indirection, right? It is a solution to all problem in CS. That's what some big guy said. But indirect means delegate, right? Redirect work to others, right? And it is one of the fundamental problem-solving tools CS. And what kind of science is CS? If the science is saying just give your work to others, right? Point star. Okay, so there's some joke there, right? Again. Indirection has been used time and again, right? What was the microprogram control in the 60s? Why was the virtual memory invented in the first place? Does anyone remember? What was the main objective behind virtual memory? Yeah. So the physical memory in those days used to be very small, and programmers needed bigger memory, right? So therefore, and no program uses all the memory at the same time. So they wanted to make an illusion that you actually have more memory than what is physically available, right? So virtual memory was essentially invented to make bigger programs fit, and making it even feasible to run.
Also, it separated the namespace for each memory for each program.
Right, that all came much later. In the beginning, the original reason why it was invented was to make bigger programs to be possible to even run, right? Because the physical memory in those days was much smaller, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Indirection assumes translation, right? See, compiler translates our abstract constructs into machine language, right? So the examples of indirection are endless, right? DNS is also an indirection mechanism where the results, name resolution is communicated to do this, right? Indirection schemes have been proposed, right? But what is not, okay, so I just go over what is there already proposed and how it is different from what I'm doing, right? So what people have figured out, right, is that spreading the identity is independent of indirection. Do you realize that? No matter how much indirection they do, the other schemes do, right? Nobody is talking about many-to-many mappings, right? Deliberately many-to-many mappings. That is the thing that I believe I'm bringing to the table. That's a fundamental new theoretical contribution here, right? Principle, okay, spreading identity for, abnormality detection, multi-level DDoS, network traceback, whatever, right? It resolves the address crunch problem. So therefore, indirection by itself is not as powerful, right, as if you combine indirection with also spreading the identity. See, spreading the identity is independent of indirection. You should realize that. Right? Nobody else in the literature has proposed this specifically to get security, right? And so many other advantages, right? And look at it. If you solve the address crunch, what more do you want? In fact, anyway. So what was okay? What is contributions to that? So the other thing is, it is so simple, right? All you need to do is, you are already doing that today. All I'm saying is, if you take the fullest advantage, take it to its logical conclusion, and simply use it to the fullest extent, there are so many benefits to be reaped, right? So this is backward compatible. See, you can deploy it only at the destination end, only at the source end, whichever way you want, right? It's backward compatible. Very little change. All you have to do is that every source side has to be willing to dedicate one box, which will keep track of the authoritative DNS servers. And there are all the issues have been thrashed through and answered multiple times in multiple reviews, right? So I don't think whatever questions you can ask, feel free to come and talk to me after the class or lecture or whatever. I'll be very glad to answer all your questions. Right? So what are the spreading identities as fundamental principle, like the principle of indirection and end-to-end principle, right? So end-to-end. So there are three principles involved here, right? Interplay of three principles in the networking arena. The celebrated end-to-end principle, you know that, right? There was a famous paper in mid-1980s by a guy called Reed and Salzer or somebody, that argued for end-to-end attributes to be controlled end-to-end. So the famous end-to-end principle, right? And the principle of indirection. See, indirection necessarily means something intermediate, not end-to-end, right? So therefore, end-to-end can sometimes clash with indirection. Right? So what I've shown here is that when that happens, you just do things edge to edge. You don't take indirection all the way to the core of the network, but you do indirection. You just push the indirection one level up, that's all. And by the way, spreading identity is completely independent of these two principles, right? It's like a third dimension. Right? So next generation internet should clearly balance all three. And see, the meta concept is universally powerful, right? So this is not just, internet is just one application. Spreading identity, right? When writing a paper, first tendency is to assign the reference. When you write reference 1, you call it reference 1, right? But later on you realize that static translation is not good, right? So that's why you give bigger names, right? So that if you change the order, you don't have to change the name of the references, right? So compiler generate virtual addresses that are dynamically bound to physical addresses at runtime, right? Credit cards is your financial identity tied to one number. Bad in the long run, you see that, right? So what should be happening is there should be protocols like the spread identity, right? That dynamically issue you a new credit card number for every single transaction, right? Such that you can only trace back that number using cryptographically secure methods, right? Social security, your identity is tied to one object. So much information, right, about you, your everything, your tax data, your medical records, everything is pretty much tied to that one number. Bad in the long run, right? Static mapping. He cannot upgrade CS to Kerberos because UIDs on master Kerberos authentication are in conflict with the current CS assignment. See, you statically assign your UIDs, right? Now they are in conflict and you cannot even upgrade your machine. So it's always a problem, right? So therefore, indirection is, so therefore the meta concept is so powerful. Anytime you translate names into names, right? The mapping should be deliberately indirect, one, and many to many. That's what the spread identity brings into the picture. If you want to exercise effective access control, then just indirection is, you cannot do it just by indirection. You have to also deliberately make it many to many, right? So therefore, what I'm looking for is so the patent for networks has been now filed, right? And it will be approved, I believe, in the next 2 or 3 months. That is good. In a way, it is good it unfolded this way because the original paper didn't have the pooling idea, 2005. So the pooling and everything will get patented, and at the same time, we'll come out with a journal paper that has been under review for 6 months now. We think it will come out in 2011. But I have to mention that I submitted this various times to Infocom and the most competitive conferences, right? The Infocom and what do you call the SIGCOMM and all that, right? But it has been rejected multiple times. So partly because we didn't have enough data, then it was not. I mean, there is too much material here, right? So this is that's the other dilemma. There is so much material, right? There are some 100 slides, right? So you can see if I had to write a comprehensive paper, it will become like almost like a small book in itself, right? 200-page thing, right? So therefore, so the idea is okay. So technically, right? Even in a spreadsheet, right? When you say okay, when I make my spreadsheet, right? When I say this is student number 1, in principle that is a static mapping, right? So therefore, to make it dynamic, every mapping should be dynamic, indirect, and make it to many, right? If you want to preserve all the good qualities. So in my dreams, I would make a backend compiler for a spreadsheet, right? That virtualizes the fields, right? So that so that they have to pay me. That's a joke. Now getting carried away, right? Just some joke here, right? Just last couple of slides. Spread is intrinsic to nature, the ultimate feature, right? Why look at this? The portfolio is spread, right? Why? So there is a fundamental question, right? Why did evolution, why as we evolved from amoeba and lower organisms to higher and higher, right? Why do the higher life forms appear to go for sexual reproduction? It's apparently evolution's attempt to spread the genetic pool to maximize the chance of survival of the species, so that all the tigers or all of us don't die because of one virus. We are genetically slightly different from each other, right? So at the most fundamental level, right? So there is spread in biological systems. At the most fundamental level, right? The Heisenberg uncertainty principle can be thought to demonstrate the spread into the very fabric of space-time, right? The continuum we inhabit. So transcending the physical realm, right? Even mathematics, the purest of pure collection of immutable truths, right? Includes notions like information theoretic entropy that governs compression, right? So therefore, so the idea is if spread is so fundamental, why don't you buy my spread identity patent and let's do business, right? That was a joke. So I do currently research in network security, DTS, blah, 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 right? And so on and so forth. And okay, just listing my areas, right? And as Chris knows, right, I have been working very heavily on the latest topic that is really exciting me is the residue number system, right? Which I think is I'm very satisfied with that work. It's a completely new method of doing arithmetic, which will be useful, extremely useful for both signal processing as well as cryptographic implementations. And I hope that it typically, I'm seriously hoping that it should find widespread use. Whatever were the problems preventing the use of that number representation in actual practice have all been taken care of by the new framework that I'm proposing. So that's what I do to get an intellectual kick, thinking that I'm not doing, because in my mind all this networking and all these things is somewhat trivial, right? In the sense that anybody sitting under a tree should be able to figure this out in 2 hours. But I don't think that anybody can say that about the residue number system, right? That's not, you can sit under the tree for all your life and may still not stumble upon the residue number results, right? But that's what we do here, and so this is just one aspect, right? The spread identity. There's so many applications. So any of you are interested in a spread identity for networks, spread identity for so the important concept is, what is the equivalent of spread identity for operating systems? What is the equivalent of spread identity for databases? You see that, right? So it is obvious that Microsoft is in a way already doing it. If you look at 2007, Windows 2007, right? The first thing that I realized was in an operating system, right? You would want to spread the identity of the super user, spread the identity of the root. Why have it the same UID and GID on every machine? You can make it different, right? And at least that seems to be being done now. Because if you buy Windows 7, right, the administrator account is no longer just called administrator. On every machine it is different. You have to give it some name, right? But at the back, if the process, what do you call the UID, the user ID is the same, then not much has been achieved. Right? But because you have to also give a different UID on every machine, and so on and so forth. So people have been obsessed with this idea of getting biological system-like properties into computing, right? So that one virus doesn't apply to all, right? This computer reacts slightly differently than that computer in response to the same virus. Now, if you are going to achieve that kind of behavior, my thinking is that it will be impossible without some kind of a spread identity. And everybody should do things slightly differently, right? And that will necessarily involve spread identity principles and indirection is what is my thinking. I think we are over time, and I will welcome any questions, comments. Have fun, and see you around. Thank you.